Hello everyone, this is chapter 43, Animal Nervous Systems. So in this chapter we're going to be looking at the vertebrate nervous system in the most detail, and we're going to look at how action potentials work and how information is transmitted through the nervous system. So really our nervous system is the control center of the body. And what it does is it allows for all of the organ systems to communicate with each other. So your brain obviously is a part of your nervous system, and it sends messages down throughout the body to various other systems and controls what they do. So along with the endocrine system, which we'll see, the nervous system works to elicit responses in the body. So we can break up the nervous system into two major parts. The central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and those are your integrating centers. So that's going to be where, ultimately a response is elicited. So when messages are sent to the central nervous system, they're integrated and they're made sense of, and then another signal is sent out to elicit a response. When the signal is sent out to elicit a response, it's sent out through the peripheral nervous system. So that's made up of all of the nerves that branch off of the brain and the spinal cord. So you've got your cranial nerves, you've got your spinal nerves, and they're all coming off of the brain and the spinal cord, respectively. So let's start with the, basic overview of the peripheral nervous system. So we can further break down the peripheral nervous system into two distinct systems. So you got the afferent and the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, the afferent division is going to take information to the central nervous system. Okay, so these neurons are going to monitor conditions inside and outside the body. So the afferent nervous system is going to detect changes, let's say, in the skin, like temperature or a pain, a cut, or something like that, and it's going to send that information down an afferent nerve to ultimately go to, in this case, the spinal cord, which is going to integrate that response. And then it's going to send the signal from the spinal cord back to, let's say, the muscle to elicit a response through an efferent signal. Okay, so you can always remember the afferent is going away from the skin towards the spinal cord, and the efferent is going, towards the muscle to an efferent nerve. And that allows the body to respond to conditions. So then anything that's going to be going, towards our brain and spinal cord is going to be part of the afferent division. So now we can look at the efferent division, so how we control those effectors, by looking at two other divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So we can look at the efferent division, and we can further break this down into the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. So it might help you when you're doing this to draw out like a concept map of the different branches of the nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is going to carry out responses that are voluntary and under conscious control. So the best example we have of that I can give you is your skeletal muscles. Your skeletal muscles are the muscles that you control consciously. So if you're moving your arm right now, if you're moving your hand to take notes, or you're moving your fingers to type, right, that's all somatic control. You're consciously controlling that. But there's a whole nother system that's controlling everything that you're not consciously thinking about. So you're not thinking about your heartbeat. You're not thinking about your digestive tract contracting. You're not thinking about glands and sweat glands eliciting a response if you're hot. All those things are controlled by your autonomic nervous system. Okay. We can further subdivide the autonomic nervous system into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch. So the sympathetic branch is going to deal with everything that's going to be your body's fight or flight response. Okay, so if you're in a situation where you're dealing with running, you're going to be, or even crying, things that are outside of your normal day-to-day functions, right? Things that are going to excite you, things that are going to scare you, things that are going to make you happy, sad, are all part of the sympathetic division. Parasympathetic is your body's rest and digestive system, is controlled by actually a branch of the parasympathetic called the enteric nervous system, but ultimately it is under the control of the parasympathetic division, your rest and digest, which is going to divert your body's electrical activity away from, things like running away from something, or it being super happy, super sad, and devote it towards body maintenance like digestion and stuff like that. But in a situation of sympathetic control, then it's going to be diverted away from digestion and go towards the body's needs, for whatever the situation is that's causing that stress. So here's that information that I just kind of talked about, parasympathetic versus sympathetic nervous system. So here's some examples of things that fall under the categories of parasympathetic and sympathetic. I talked about some of these. So, your body switches back and forth between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So think about all the things that you would need in a fight or flight situation. You want to be able to see better, so you can dilate your pupils. You're not digesting, so everything's going to go away from digestion, so you're not going to be salivating. Your heart rate is going to increase to get more blood. Your airways are going to dilate to get more oxygen. You're not digesting, okay? Stimulating the release of glucose, because we want to break down that glucose and get energy from that glucose to power our muscles. Okay, epinephrine, norepinephrine as well are part of that response. Okay, the bladder is relaxed in this case. You're not urinating. Okay, ejaculation as well is controlled by the sympathetic response, which is kind of interesting because on the flip side, erection is caused by the parasympathetic response, which is where you're relaxing. So kind of interesting. And you can see that everything is kind of the opposite in the parasympathetic when you're resting and digesting. So very general look at the human brain, and most vertebrates have a similar structure. So there's 4 major chunks to the brain. There's the big wrinkly part, the cerebellum towards the back. If you slice the brain in half, you get to see the diencephalon inside, and then connecting to the spinal cord is the brainstem. Okay? So when we talk about the cerebrum, that wrinkly part, like I said, that's where you're going to have your left and right hemispheres. You're going to have the lobes of the brain, the frontal lobe, left and right parietal lobes, occipital lobes, and that's where you're going to have your conscious thought, your memory, your more higher level functionings taking place in the cerebrum, specifically in the frontal lobe. The cerebellum is in the back of your brain, and it looks like almost like a tiny brain, and that's going to coordinate motor patterns and balance and things like that. The diencephalon is in the central part of the brain inside, and it's a relay station from the brainstem and the spinal cord to all the other areas of the brain. Brainstem is the most primal, so when you look at the brain, you have the most complex in the front, and then as it goes to the back, you get more of the automatic or autonomic things. So the brainstem is going to deal with heart regulation, lungs, digestive system, and stuff like that. All right, so here's a nice kind of picture showing you those different lobes of the brain. The cerebrum, like I said, this is the large part. There's the diencephalon in there, okay, which connects down into the brainstem. Okay, and the brainstem made up of the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata in there, and are involved in various functions of primal things. Cerebellum, okay, there it is. If you cut it in half, you can see it's got this tree-like pattern. It's called the arbor vitae. Kind of resembles a tree. Okay, and there's the lobes of the brain there on the right. Connecting the brain, the 2 hemispheres, is something called the corpus callosum. Okay, so the cerebral hemisphere has the 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, and that is going to go along with the names of the bones as well that are covering them. The corpus callosum connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain, and the size of the brain varies among vertebrates. So in fishes, the cerebrum is very small. There's not, like I said, I think I mentioned it in an earlier lecture, not a whole lot of thought going on in fish, just mainly the sense of smell. However, in mammals, especially the great apes, the cerebrum is very large, and we see reasoning, memory, learning, very important. Multiple processing of our environment through sensory and motor functions as well is accomplished in the cerebrum. Okay, and here's another look, and some look at what the areas of the brain correspond to here. Okay, so sight is in the back in the occipital lobe. Okay, here we can see spatial visualization, analysis, hearing, sense of touch and temperature, and the motor cortex as well in here. Okay, if you look at a cross section, you can see where in the body sense of touch and temperature is going to be relayed from these different areas. Okay, and this was determined by doing kind of open, brain surgery and actually stimulating these parts of the brain while a person was awake and mapping out where they felt the sensation. So kind of interesting. So researchers want to understand this whole idea of the human brain. It's very complex. There's a lot we don't know. Research has been done to really uncover a lot of this, the secrets of the brain, I guess you can say. But we can really look at the most fundamental unit of the brain and all of the nervous system as being the neuron. And the neuron is one of two cells in the body, the muscle cells being another one, that are electrically stimulated. Okay, so they have an electrical potential to them. So the neurons will send electrical potentials out to the body. So when we look at all animals, except sponges, they have neurons and they have muscle cells. And neurons communicate to the muscle cells, which elicit movement. We talked about this a little bit earlier when we introduced animals, but there's two basic types of nervous systems. So either a diffuse arrangement of these neurons called a nerve net, which we find in our cnidarians and our ctenophores, or in our more complex animals, mammals, reptiles, fish, we have a central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system coming off of it with a large cerebral ganglia or a brain controlling the nervous system. So there's different types of neurons. So again, the neuron is this cell, and these are all examples of different types of neurons here, and these are all connected to each other and ultimately eliciting a response to an effector. But sensory neurons do just that. They sense information, and then they carry that information via afferent pathways to the central nervous system. So what does a sensory neuron sense? Well, it looks for light, sound, touch, other stimuli. Anything can be eliciting, anything that's going to elicit a response had to initially come from a sensory neuron. So you see, let's say you're driving in your car and the street light turns red. Okay, that's a response to a visual stimuli, and you're going to ultimately integrate that in your brain, and your brain's going to tell your leg to tell your foot to step on the gas. No, not step on the gas. Step on the brake pedal. Stop your car. Right? That's all integrated in the nervous system. So those are external sensory cells, and then there's also internal sensory cells that are going to monitor various conditions inside the body, like blood pH, oxygen levels, blood pressure, all that stuff, and ultimately send a response to increase or decrease them accordingly if needed by releasing hormones or other factors. Okay, so those are your sensory neurons, your afferent neurons, and then they're going to ultimately synapse or communicate with interneurons. Okay, so in vertebrates, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, which is going to integrate the information from the sensory neurons. So they are going to pass from one neuron to another. Some interneurons are going to connect to motor neurons, which are going to send the information to the muscle cells. Okay, in most places. It could be glands as well. Motor neurons and sensory neurons are bundled together into long strands called nerves. Okay, and that's the nerves that run all throughout the body, your cranial and spinal nerves and branches thereof. Okay, so you got your your skin here or some external factor or internal factor that's going to send information to the sensory neuron, the afferent neurons, and then that's going to communicate with the interneurons within the central nervous system. So these are the ones that are in the brain, in the spinal cord, and then they're going to ultimately synapse with your motor neurons or your efferent neurons, which are going to elicit a response to the effector, which in this picture is the muscle. All the components outside of the brain, so all the nerves, okay, so everything that's not an interneuron is going to be PNS, or peripheral nervous system. So sensory information is transmitted via the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, where it's processed. The response is transmitted back through the peripheral nervous system to appropriate parts of the body via motor neurons. This is a very important pathway, this monosynaptic reflex, very simple. There's a stimulus that occurs, okay? Again, if we go back to the example I used earlier, the stimulus is the red light. Okay, the information is sent to the receptor, okay, in the eye. Stimulus, let's say the receptor's in the eye, sends the information to the efferent pathway in the sensory neuron. Okay, so actually, not a great example because this would be using the brain. The spinal cord is shown here. So let's scratch the red light for this. Let's say you stepped on a thumbtack. Stimulus is you stepped on a thumbtack on your foot, and the receptors on your foot, and all of a sudden it's sending the message of pain and blood to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord is going to ultimately send the information via somatic to a somatic motor neuron through an efferent target cell to elicit a response, and that response would be lifting your foot up. Okay, so that's integrated in the spinal cord. That's a reflex. Okay, so the red light is a more complicated response, but same idea. Okay, so here's again a simple example. They talked about pricking your finger on a rose. Same thing as kind of stepping on a thumbtack. So let's look at a neuron in some more detail, the anatomy of a single cell neuron. So neurons are pretty unique. They're pretty cool. They have a large part called the cell body, which contains a nucleus, and coming off of the cell body are these dendrites. And dendrites are going to receive information from the axon terminals of a neighboring neuron. So you can imagine another neuron kind of right next to this one, and they're going to be communicating with each other. So the cell body has the nucleus, it has the organelles in there as well, mitochondria, things like that. Coming off of the cell body, in addition to the dendrites, is one long, in most cases, in some cases, not always, in one long axon. The axon is going to be where action potentials, which are electrical signals, are going to be sent down the neuron. And these axons, these long axons, are going to be bundled up into nerves. Okay, and these axons contain structures called myelin sheath, which kind of act as an insulator and allow for action potentials or electrical signals to kind of jump and go more quickly than if they weren't there. So I usually explain, to students that, the idea of the myelin sheath would be like if you were on a document and you were trying to get from one end, so if you're in Microsoft Word and you're on a document and you want to get from one start of the page to the other side of the page, you can hit the space bar, right, and that would be very slow, or you can hit the tab, and hitting the tab is kind of like what the myelin sheath is like. Okay, so I mentioned action potential. So what is an action potential? So an action potential is just essentially how a message is transmitted down an axon. Okay, so it's an electrical signal. In order to get electricity, you need to have charge in motion and a flipping of charge take place. So when this happens along a neuron, it's going to happen between the axon and the external environment. And a change in the potential of the membrane is a change in charge. So I'm not going to get into this too much. If this were, again, an anatomy and physiology course, we would spend more time with it. But you just want to recognize that in an action potential, or the transmission of this electrical potential, there's three phases that take place. Depolarization, which is where the membrane becomes less negative. Okay, in order to get less negative, the positively charged sodium ions are going to go into a nerve cell. So you have to realize to become less negative, you're more positive. So that means more positive sodium ions rush in. Okay. After depolarization, repolarization takes place, closing the sodium ion channels. Okay, and now we end up going back to a negative charge on the membrane. Okay, potassium is released in this stage. And then lastly, the refractory phase, where the sodium-potassium pump actively transports sodium and potassium ions to restore the nerve cell membrane. Okay, so just recognize those three phases. Okay, and this is what's happening here. If we look kind of at a picture, in the first stage, depolarization, the membrane is going to depolarize as those sodium ions rush in. So sodium channels open up and sodium ions flush into the cell. And you can see now originally at rest we had all positives on the outside, all negatives on the inside. Now as the sodiums go in, this is going to all flip to positive. And that's going to propagate down the length of the axon. The action potential triggers, like I said, those sodium channels to open. And here to restore, so the action potential is moving down, and potassium is coming back out to restore the membrane potential back to rest. Okay, and that's what's happening here in step 3. Now you want to recognize this graph. Okay, this is an important graph to take a look at and kind of how it corresponds to what's going on here. So here's our resting membrane potential. And once we get into depolarization, sodium channels are opening and sodium is flooding in, okay, until we get to positive 40. Once we get to positive 40, the voltage-gated sodium channels close and the potassium channels open, and now the membrane potential rapidly goes down. Okay, and then here at the hyperpolarization phase, the sodium-potassium pump kicks in to bring it back to normal resting potential. Okay, so this corresponds with this. And I'll have some additional animations for you to help with that as well, in addition to the lecture and reading your textbook. So I mentioned myelin sheath, and how it's like hitting the space bar or hitting the tab versus the space bar. So how does that work? So in vertebrate neurons, the myelin sheath is actually made up of cells. And in the peripheral nervous system, the cells that make up the myelin sheath are called Schwann cells. The ones that make them up in the central nervous system are called oligodendrocytes. So just go back real quick. Schwann cells, there they are. This is actually a cell wrapping up the axon. Okay. Specifically, the oligodendrocytes, the Schwann cells, are other cells in the nervous system called glial cells, and they act to support the neurons. So there's other ones called astrocytes, and they kind of work to support the neuron. And there's microglial cells, and there's a whole bunch of other ones, and they all are part of the nervous system. They're just not the neuron. So when these cells wrap around the axon, so the oligodendrocytes, the Schwann cells, they act as electrical insulation, preventing ions from leaking out during the propagation of an action potential, thus speeding it up. So without myelination, it's not possible to have an effective action potential takes place. So the space that's in between the myelin are called the nodes of Ranvier. And again, the action potential jumps from node to node to node. And this figure at the bottom is showing you how myelination prevents ions from leaking out, okay, and why they work so well. Okay, you can see how thick the Schwann cell is here. Here we're cut around this way. Looks almost like a jelly roll wrapped around the axon. If myelin degenerates, then we see the electrical signal slowing down. So in different diseases, such as multiple sclerosis, we see that the immune system attacks the oligodendrocytes, and the myelin breaks down, and then obviously the person with MS the nervous system cannot effectively communicate with their muscles, and it can be very devastating. So myelin is very important. So I mentioned how the dendrites of an axon cell body, or a neuron cell body, communicate with the dendrites of a neighboring neuron or a muscle cell. And there's a little space in between the dendrites and the axons, and it's called the synaptic cleft. And we're going to talk about this more when we talk about the muscular system and muscle contraction in a later chapter. But at the ends of the axon, there are synaptic vesicles that contain structures called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are a way for a neuron to communicate with a neighboring neuron or with a muscle cell. So at the synapse, the neuron that contains the synaptic vesicles is called the presynaptic neuron, and then the one after it is called the postsynaptic neuron, or the postsynaptic cell if it's not a neuron. Okay. So let's look over on the left first. So here's one neuron, here's another neuron. So we've got the axon terminal of this neuron, we've got the axon, we've got the cell body, and then we've got the axon terminal of this neuron. And these two are communicating with each other, and this neuron is going to send a message to this neuron by sending neurotransmitters. Okay, actually it's the other way around. This is the presynaptic, this is the postsynaptic. Okay, but they're going to communicate with each other. So here's what's happening at the synaptic cleft. Okay, so this can be the neuromuscular junction. This could be the junction between two neurons. In this case, that's what it is. So here's, again, we're zooming in on what's happening here. This is the end of the axon of one neuron, and this is the dendrite of a neighboring neuron. Okay, so action potential is going down to right here. Action potential arrives near the synaptic cleft, which is right here. Once that action potential arrives, calcium channels are going to open, and calcium is going to enter presynaptic cells. What that does is it then signals these little vesicles, so there's the calcium going in, signaling these vesicles to release neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. That neurotransmitter is then going to bind to these receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, okay, and when this happens, it's going to change the membrane potential of this postsynaptic neuron, and it's going to elicit its own action potential that's then going to travel down its axon, okay? So you can kind of think of the neurotransmitters as being a way of continuing an action potential from one neuron to the next neuron or to one neuron to a muscle cell. Okay. So what do neurotransmitters do? Again, they bind to receptors called ligand-gated ion channels that have a binding site for a specific ligand on the channel protein that faces the synaptic cleft. So that's what's happening. That's what's happening here. They're binding to these ligand-gated protein channels. The ligand-gated ion channels open in response to the neurotransmitter and emits a flow of ions along electrochemical gradient. Okay, so that's how we transduce the electrical signal to the postsynaptic cell. All right, so here's another look at this taking place. Okay, so the same kind of thing here. So the synthesis of neurotransmitter happens up here. Transport of the neurotransmitter down the axon. Action potential travels down the axon. Okay, the action potential causes the calcium to enter, evoking the release of the neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter attaches to the receptors. That's going to elicit the postsynaptic neuron to change its voltage. Ultimately, it's going to be recycled up. Any that's going to be taken is going to be broken down, and the process starts all over again. So here's some examples of neurotransmitters. You may have heard of some of these. If you haven't heard of acetylcholine, you want to remember it because we're going to be talking about it when we talk about muscles. And acetylcholine is going to be involved in the neuromuscular junction. It's the neurotransmitter that is going to be eliciting muscle contraction. So when, let's say this was a muscle cell, when this neuron releases acetylcholine, it's going to trigger that muscle cell to contract. Some monoamines, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, these are going to be involved in various mood-altering neurotransmitters. And kind of interesting here, some of these drugs that interfere with the neurotransmitters. So Ritalin, which is used for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is going to increase the release of norepinephrine. Antidepressants can actually inhibit the reuptake of norepinephrine, and because sometimes if someone is clinically depressed, it's not something that is someone's fault. It's something that's an imbalance in these neurotransmitters. So antidepressants can stop the excessive breaking down of norepinephrine and help someone with depression, which is really great. Cocaine and amphetamines prevent reuptake as well, so they have the same effect. Ecstasy will increase your levels of serotonin, making you feel better in the short term. Now, the problem with these is that once you stop taking these drugs, your body will stop producing their own, and you end up crashing, and it's very hard to come back from that. You become dependent, and there's also lots of other negative effects to taking synthetic drugs to supply what your body already makes. Glutamate is an amino acid. Neurotransmitters, GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, and these as well are involved in excitatory and inhibitory responses. Endorphins as well are involved in pain management. Okay, so, know where to find this information. Pretty interesting. All right, so that will end this chapter on animal nervous system. I hope you learned it, and I will see you again next time.